Hello, everyone. I wish you all a wonderful day filled with peace and happiness. Today, we're going to explore the emotional story of a homeless woman who was abandoned by her husband, but unexpectedly found hope when a kind stranger gave her a place to stay and slowly helped her heal. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next videos. Tuan had lived in that quiet countryside house for years, the kind of place where nothing unusual ever really happened. So when he stepped outside that morning and noticed something strange near the haystack, he immediately felt it. At first, he thought it was just a pile of old cloth, or maybe an animal resting. But as he got closer, he realized there was a person lying there, completely still. His steps slowed. A mix of confusion and caution filled his mind as he approached carefully, unsure of what he might find. When he finally stood close enough, he saw her clearly. A young woman, curled up tightly, her clothes dirty and worn, her face pale with exhaustion, breathing so lightly it almost looked like she wasn't breathing at all. For a moment, Tuan just stood there, stunned. Then concern quickly replaced his hesitation. He leaned down slightly and called out to her, his voice firm but not harsh, asking who she was and why she was lying there. The woman flinched awake, startled and disoriented. Fear flashed across her eyes as she quickly tried to sit up, pulling herself away from him as if expecting to be chased off at any second. Before Tuan could say anything else, she began apologizing repeatedly, her voice shaky and rushed, as though she had said those same words many times before. She explained that she had nowhere else to go, that she had only stayed there for the night because she had no place to sleep. When Tuan asked where her home was, she hesitated for a moment, her gaze dropping to the ground. Then quietly, almost as if the words hurt to say, she admitted that she didn't have a home to go back to. The way she said it carried more weight than the words themselves. There was something broken underneath, something she didn't fully explain. When he asked about her family, she paused again, clearly avoiding the full truth, only saying that she couldn't stay with them right now. At first, Tuan had been cautious. Anyone would be. But the more he listened, the more his expression softened. There was no sign of deception in her, only exhaustion, embarrassment, and a quiet kind of dignity. Even in her situation, she wasn't asking for help. She was apologizing for existing in the wrong place. And just as quickly as she had woken up, she tried to leave. She gathered her few belongings in a hurry, insisting that she would go somewhere else, that she didn't want to cause any trouble. But when Tuan asked where she planned to go, she couldn't answer. That silence said everything. That was the moment he made his decision. Tuan stopped her before she could walk away and told her there was an old house nearby. It hadn't been used in a long time, but if it was cleaned up a little, it would still be livable. It wasn't much, but it was better than sleeping outside. The woman, Hana, though he didn't know her name yet, looked at him with hesitation. You could see it in her eyes. She wasn't used to kindness like this, or maybe she had learned not to trust it too easily. She tried to refuse, gently, saying she didn't want to trouble him, but Tuan didn't push or insist in a forceful way. He simply reassured her that the house had been empty for a long time anyway, that she wouldn't be bothering anyone, and that she could stay there temporarily until she figured things out. There was a quiet patience in the way he spoke, and eventually, Hana nodded. They walked together in silence for a short distance until they reached the house. From the outside, it looked almost abandoned. Tall grass had grown wildly around it, and the wooden door was worn and stiff from years of disuse. Tuan stepped forward and pushed it open, the hinges creaking loudly as if protesting after being left alone for too long. Dust filled the air inside, and everything looked old and neglected. It wasn't a place anyone would choose to live in, but at that moment, it was something more than that. It was shelter. It was safety. Tuan stepped inside first, showing her around, pointing out the different areas of the house as if it were something completely normal. There was no sense of pity in his tone, no attempt to make the situation feel dramatic. He treated it simply as a practical solution. Hana stood there quietly, taking everything in. Her eyes moved slowly from one corner to another, as if trying to convince herself this was real. For the first time since they met, her expression softened. Just a little. Without saying much, Tuan began clearing some space, moving aside old items and brushing away dust. He showed her where the water tank was outside, explaining that the water was still clean and could be used. He pointed out the basic tools she could use, things that might seem small, but meant everything to someone starting over from nothing. Hana followed him closely, listening carefully, nodding again and again, thanking him over and over in a quiet voice. Each thank you sounded sincere, almost heavy, as if she didn't know how else to respond to what he was doing. Tuan didn't make a big deal out of it. He didn't tell her she owed him anything. He didn't ask questions he didn't need answers to. He simply helped, naturally, as if it was the most ordinary thing in the world. After making sure she could manage on her own for now, he told her he needed to head back. There was no long speech, no dramatic moment, just a simple goodbye, and then he left, closing the door behind him, leaving Hana alone in the quiet house. For a while, she didn't move. She stood there, listening to the silence, as if she wasn't used to it. Slowly, she walked further inside and sat down on the floor. Her hands reached out, touching the rough wooden surface beside her, then the wall, grounding herself in the reality of the moment. This place wasn't perfect. It wasn't even comfortable yet. But it was something she hadn't had in a long time. A place where no one would chase her away. Her shoulders, tense for so long, finally relaxed. She let out a quiet breath she didn't even realize she had been holding. And in that moment, something changed. It was small, almost unnoticeable, but it was there. A faint sense of relief. The very beginning of hope. For the first time in days, maybe longer, Hana had a safe place to sleep. And without realizing it, that small, fragile moment became the beginning of a new chapter in her life. The next few days passed quietly, but they carried a different kind of weight. Hana woke up early each morning and immediately started cleaning the house. She wiped down surfaces, swept the floors, and organized whatever she could find. Every action she took was careful and deliberate, as if she was afraid of damaging something that didn't even belong to her. It wasn't just about cleaning. It was her way of proving that she deserved to stay there, even if only temporarily. At the same time, Tuan would occasionally stop by, bringing small things with him. Nothing expensive or excessive, just practical items from his own home that he no longer needed. Each time he arrived, Hana would react the same way, surprised, hesitant, and deeply grateful. She would try to refuse at first, saying she didn't want to trouble him, but Tuan always found a simple way to reassure her. He told her the items were just extras, that she would actually be helping him by using them, instead of letting them go to waste. There was something gentle in the way he handled everything. He never made her feel like a burden. One day, while Hana was busy cleaning inside, Tuan worked outside. He repaired the broken door, replacing it with a sturdier one that could keep out the wind at night. He cleared the overgrown weeds in the yard, making space for her to potentially grow vegetables in the future. He didn't announce what he was doing. He simply did it. When Hana noticed, she stood there quietly, watching him for a moment, unsure of what to say. Gratitude filled her chest, but at the same time, there was a lingering discomfort. She wasn't used to receiving this kind of care without conditions. Still, she didn't let herself depend on it completely. Every day, she made an effort to go into the nearby village, asking around for work. She walked from place to place, accepting whatever small opportunities she could find. Sometimes it was helping with simple chores. Sometimes it was nothing at all. But she kept trying. She bought the cheapest food she could afford, making sure she wasn't relying entirely on what Tuan gave her. She wanted to stand on her own again. And slowly, something began to shift. Not just in her circumstances, but in her. The fear that once filled her every movement started to fade, replaced by something quieter, something steadier. Then, one evening, everything changed in a small but meaningful way. Tuan came by with food he had prepared, inviting her to sit down and eat together. It was a simple meal, nothing fancy, but the atmosphere felt different. For the first time, they weren't just helping and being helped, they were sharing a moment. They sat across from each other, the space between them filled with a quiet, slightly awkward silence at first. Neither of them spoke much in the beginning, but that silence wasn't uncomfortable, it was calm. And then, gradually, they began to talk. At first, their conversation was simple, almost cautious, like two people carefully stepping onto unfamiliar ground. Tuan asked small questions, nothing too personal, just enough to keep the moment going. Hana answered politely, her voice still soft but no longer trembling the way it had before. There was a pause at one point, and then Tuan smiled slightly and said he realized they still didn't even know each other's names. It was such a small detail, but it somehow made the moment feel more real. "My name is Tuan," he said. Hana hesitated for a second, as if even something as simple as saying her name carried weight. Then she replied quietly, "My name is Hana." Tuan nodded, repeating her name once, almost thoughtfully. "Hana, that's a beautiful name." That small moment broke something invisible between them. The distance that had existed before began to shrink, just a little. As they continued eating, Tuan gently shifted the conversation, asking about her family. It wasn't an interrogation. His tone was careful, giving her space to answer or avoid it if she wanted. Hana lowered her gaze to the food in front of her. For a few seconds, she didn't say anything. You could see the hesitation clearly, the internal struggle between wanting to stay silent and wanting to finally let something out. Then, slowly, she began to speak. Her voice wasn't steady, but she didn't stop. She told him that her family lived not too far away in a neighboring village. On the surface, it sounded like she wasn't completely alone in the world. But then she continued, and the truth started to unfold. She admitted that she was married. That part surprised Tuan, but he didn't interrupt. He just listened. Hana's hands tightened slightly as she spoke, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She explained that her husband had changed, that he had found someone else. At first, she didn't go into detail, but then the words came out more clearly. He didn't need her anymore. That was what he had said. And it wasn't just those words, it was the way he said them. Cold, dismissive, as if she had no value left. For a brief moment, her voice broke. She described how he had humiliated her, how he had made her feel small, how he had pushed her out of her own home without hesitation. There was no anger in the way she spoke, which somehow made it even more painful. It wasn't rage. It was quiet hurt, the kind that lingers long after everything is over. Tuan didn't say anything right away. He didn't interrupt her, didn't offer empty reassurances or try to change the subject. He just sat there, listening, giving her the space to say everything she needed to say. That silence, that patience, meant more than any immediate response could have. When she finally stopped, the air between them felt heavier, but also clearer, like something that had been locked away for too long had finally been released. For a moment, Hana looked down, almost as if she regretted saying so much. But Tuan's expression didn't change. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pity either, just understanding. And then he spoke. "If someone doesn't cherish you," he said calmly, "you don't need to stay." The words were simple. There was nothing dramatic about them. But the way he said it carried a quiet certainty, the kind that didn't demand agreement, but invited reflection. Hana didn't respond right away. She just sat there, absorbing what he had said. Her eyes slowly lifted to meet his, and something shifted in her expression. It wasn't a sudden transformation. It was subtle, but it was there. For the first time, someone had looked at her situation, not as something she had to endure, but as something she had the right to walk away from. No blame, no expectation, just a choice. That realization settled quietly inside her. The conversation didn't continue in a heavy way after that. Tuan gently changed the subject, encouraging her to eat more, mentioning that the food would taste best while it was still warm. Hana nodded, and followed along, but something inside her had already begun to change. They finished their meal slowly, without rushing. The atmosphere felt lighter now, even though they had just talked about something painful. In a strange way, sharing that truth had made things easier, not harder. After they finished eating, Tuan stood up to clean a few things, but Hana quickly moved to help him. This time, her movements were more natural, less hesitant. She didn't feel like a stranger in the space anymore. Later that evening, after Tuan had left, Hana stayed behind in the quiet house once again. But it didn't feel the same as before. She stepped outside for a moment, looking at the sky above. The air was calm, the surroundings peaceful. She stood there for a while, letting the silence settle around her. Then she slowly looked back at the house. It was still the same old house. The walls were still worn, the space still simple. But to her, it felt different now. It felt like a place she could belong, even if only for a while. She walked back inside and sat down, her hands resting gently in her lap. A faint smile appeared on her face, almost without her realizing it. It wasn't a big smile, it wasn't forced. It was quiet, soft, and real. For so long, her world had been filled with rejection, with words that made her feel worthless, with moments that left her questioning her own value. But now, something had shifted. Not everything was better, not everything was solved, but for the first time, she believed that maybe, just maybe, things could change. That maybe her life didn't end where someone else decided it did. That maybe she could build something again, piece by piece. As she looked around the small space, her gaze steady and calm, that fragile sense of hope began to grow just a little stronger. And in that quiet moment, without any grand declaration, Hana finally started to believe that her life could become better. Hana, a homeless woman abandoned and emotionally hurt by her husband, is found sleeping in a haystack by Tuan, a quiet and kind man. Though cautious at first, Tuan chooses to help her by offering an old, unused house nearby. With patience and simple acts of care, he provides her with shelter, clean water, and basic necessities, without asking for anything in return. As days pass, Hana works hard to clean the house, search for jobs, and regain her independence. Tuan continues to support her in small but meaningful ways, creating a sense of safety she has long lost. During a simple meal, Hana opens up about her painful past, and Tuan gently reminds her of her worth. Slowly, Hana begins to heal, rediscover confidence, and believe that her life can become better again in the future ahead for herself.